So Bafundi, I want to be putting in the lining for these sleeves. So you can see I've already put the sleeve in, already put the sleeve cap in here. Now I need to join the, what is it called, the shoulder pad. So I'm just going to go around. Obviously, I check this before I stitch the sleeve that the shoulder pad is coming to the edge of the seam allowance on the jacket. So now I'm just going to pin that in place. You can baste this. It really depends how you feel emotionally. But anyway, that's all kept in place. Now I'm going to go into the inside and I'm just going to, by hand, stitch that on. And you see here, I'm going to just pull it to actually match. I don't want to mismatch like that. Because I know, like I said, I checked before I did this, that it is actually matching on the edge of the seam allowance. So I'm going to go and do that by hand. The trick with the lining is that you only stitch to the elbow. This portion of the lining you leave. So let me finish preparing that, and then the next portion will be easy peasy. Will be to make sure we have the correct sleeve lining and to stitch this into the lining. Obviously right sides together, so I'm just going to be following my notches, sewing that in. Now usually I leave the center back open for a bit, but this is, because it's a coat, there's a lot of space down here, so I can get in here easily and stitch that lining right sides together. So there we are, nothing too exciting. I've just sewed the lining in there, and let's get in there. The shoulder pad has just been stitched down by hand. Now, of course, if we were doing the horsehair, you'd also be stitching the horsehair one time here into the seam allowance. Same story. I always use a back stitch that there's a little bit of movement. Now, this is a commercial pattern that I'm making for someone. So, I haven't cut it quite how I cut bespoke. So let's just look at the undersleeve for the sleeve. There's going to be your undersleeve of the fabric. Now, if you're doing the lining, here, this portion, your underpitch, needs to come up 2 seams. Whatever your seam allowance is, coming up 2 seams. You're coming out 2 seams, out 2 seams. This front seam here, you can lift maybe half a seam. This back you don't have to lift. You can keep that exactly where it is. So then you've lifted that there and you can rejoin that. Reason being that this portion has to fold over. Let's look at the jacket. So you see this underarm here, you can imagine the seam allowance is there. So this piece is just falling flat. But for the lining, it's going to be stitched here. It's going to have to travel up that seam allowance, over the seam allowance, and then down. So you need 2 extra seam allowances. And of course, if you just add the seam allowances, if your shape is like this, and you add 2 seam allowances there, your underarm is going to be too tight. Now, it's not such a drama because the top of the sleeve, usually you're gathering a lot. So what you can do is just not gather this so much so that this will then sync and match, and then you'll just know your seam allowances there won't match. And like now, because it's a commercial pattern, so you have to pay me a certain amount before I'm going to do that kind of manipulation on the sleeve of on the lining of the sleeve. So what I've done, it's exactly the same, the fabric and the lining, and then I've just gathered it here a little bit less so that there's more gather here, which will give me more excess to turn over. So once you've got all that ready, here we use this opening of the sleeve to get in here and actually pull this whole sleeve through the lining like that. And then here you want to match your seams. Now, because of everything we've been discussing, you don't want to match the seams of your sleeve. You want to match the seams of the jacket. So match that seam to that seam on the jacket. There are the seams together. But probably if we look, here's the, you see, here's the seam of the sleeve ending about here, and here's the seam of the sleeve lining. So maybe like 1.5 centimeters difference because of just what I was explaining. And then seam of the jacket to seam of the jacket. There we go. And again, I'm going to come around and do a back stitch, but the one difference here is that I'm going to do it quite loose, similar to a tailor's tack, because you do want this to have a bit of movement. Just get that all in place. Okay, let's look at fashion. Okay. So yeah, I want to stay close to the seam allowance, but I don't have to be right on it. And I'm just going to do a back stitch, but I'm not going to tighten it. I'm going to leave just a little bit of a loop. And just carry on. Just leave a little bit of a loop, and that's going to give me quite a bit of movement for the lining in the sleeve, but it's going to join all the way around the lining to the armhole, which I quite like. And with that done, of course, we pop it back out the right way around, and see there's the lining attached. It's still a nice amount of movement. So now we're going to go through the sleeve, bringing this to the right side or into the sleeve, however you want to look at it. And now we're going to finish up these seams, the front and the back. You do want to leave either front or back, doesn't really matter, about 1 hand space. We're going to get in there to finish off this piece on the cuff. So that is going to happen. Don't judge me, I actually have no idea what happened, why the front is a little bit shorter, or the undersleeve is a little bit shorter than the back sleeve. I'll have to double check what is happening with this pattern. But small things like that, sometimes I won't spot until I actually put it together, and then I'll go back to the pattern and correct it. Now with the lining done, first thing you need to do is just check your length. Now depending on how the pattern is done, ideally you want your lining to be exactly at the end of where your finished cuff is. So I'm doing a bit longer. I'm a little bit skeptical. I am going to cut off this top sleeve. You know, my habit when I cut is always to cut a little bit extra, and sometimes that habit gets out of control. So I'll have to check if this is actually a patterning problem or a Benjamin problem. And I always double check my lining. Now the other trick that you need to do here is when you stitch this portion together, you need to leave a little piece for the seam allowance. Again, you can see that isn't matching. Stop judging me. So we're going to use that as our seam allowance. I'm just going to pin this quickly and see that my lining doesn't poke out too much. How you do, you check, we've got this is the back seam, here's the front seam, of the lining. There's the front seam of the lining. You put my hand through here and grab those two seams one time. Just pull that through. And then depending how good the pattern is, these should fit together. If it's a little bit big, you can do a bit of a gather, the lining. If it's too small, it's better to open a seam rather than try and gather it a little bit. The sleeve, you don't want to gather the sleeve. And here, you know, it can be easier to stitch actually with a zip foot to get right to that edge. But you know, it's also not a drama. You can just stitch to there, jump, stitch from there, go all the way around. And then you do want to check. See, once I've stitched that, I've put it back, and this does look fine. You don't see the lining poking out, but if you put your hand through, I feel like it's going to just pull out there a little bit. So I'm going to just trim that down. I do like it to sort of stop at the edge here. And then you can also see if it's not too tight. You don't want to see like a little fold like that on the sleeve if it's too tight anywhere. So you let it lie how it wants to lie, make it glush with the finished edge, and then you'll stitch it up there. So I'm going to trim this and then stitch that up. There, it's just been stitched around. One thing I did before I stitched this, I just unpinned that section and stitched it together there so it doesn't end up unraveling there. And now the last thing I'm going to do, the easier method would be to just use some double-sided fusing, like the hem fusing. Just stick it in there, give it a fuse, there you're done. But as you know, I'm not love to be extra, so I'm just going to go around and give it a bit of a quick hand stitch. I'm going to do a herringbone so that we still have some movement. I'm going to try not to embarrass myself by forgetting to knot this thread. Yeah, you know, basically same as a trouser hem, a suit hem. You just want to pick up one or two threads. Here it really doesn't have to be so many stitches on top of each other. I can leave maybe 2-3 centimeters between each stitch, because it really is just to help it stay in place. Obviously the fusing, the cut of the pattern, all of those things are helping it already. And of course that vent where the buttons are, you know, that's kind of held in place by the buttons. Now here, you know, if I was doing the glue situation, then at least here on the seam, I would do a bit of a catch. Now my seams are not matching. You can just stop judging me with that. This has been quite an interesting pattern, seeing all the interesting things that have happened and wondering how much of them is a me problem. But, you know, in any event, yeah, this is what I'm doing. Just going around stitching that similar to a suit hem, except for a suit hem I wouldn't be using a herringbone stitch. And if you feel that the sleeve is bigger than the cuff, you can just make sure the stitches are nice and broad, because you know the cuff is going to be on the inside, so it can be a little bit smaller than the sleeve. You just don't want to catch any bubbles anywhere. Yeah, and then here again, you know, you can really come and stitch through those, the seam allowance that's there behind the buttons. And that is basically that. Of course, with that done, we are then going to shift this back through and go ahead and just stitch that together. And yeah, there we'll have it, joining the lining on the jacket sleeve. Square D lay.